All right, here we have another lecture video in philosophy of law. This time we're going to begin our discussion of law and morality. We're going to look at the example of the Nuremberg trials. And we'll also see some issues that arise relative to the Nuremberg trials and the rule of law. So, what were the Nuremberg trials? To put the Nuremberg trials in context, we have to first talk a little bit about World War II. Now, officially, World War II lasted from 1939 to 1945, although the stage was set years earlier by the rise to power of Adolf Hitler in Germany. The war was fought between the Axis powers, which included Germany, Japan, and Italy, and the Allied powers, which included the United States, Russia, England, and France. During the war, around 50 to 80 million people were killed, 38% of whom were military and 62% were civilian. We don't have exact numbers, but this is a vast amount of people and a vast percentage of the population of the world at that time. Throughout the war and before, Germany was ruled by the Nazi Party under Chancellor Adolf Hitler, who was known as the Führer. Eventually, the Allied powers were victorious and defeated the Axis. Hitler himself committed suicide before he could be taken into custody or killed. After the war ended, the Allied powers conducted criminal trials. The defendants were high-ranking Nazi officials and German military leaders, and the judges were from the Allied side. And the defendants had defense counsel, and there were also prosecutors, just like in any other criminal trial that you may be familiar with. Several charges were leveled at the defendants. These were crimes against peace, war of aggression. The Nazis and others invaded other countries to take them over and to make them part of their empires. There were war crimes. There were murder of prisoners of war and civilians. Crimes against humanity, genocide and mass murder. You may have heard of the Holocaust, in which many millions of Jews, gypsies, and others who the Nazis considered undesirable were killed. And finally, conspiracy. And under this charge, if one is found guilty of conspiracy, then a defendant would be considered guilty of any of the other crimes that others had committed because they were part of this group that conducted this crime. Now, it's generally believed that what the Nazis did was immoral, but the question is, was it illegal? Typically, after war is over, high-ranking officials in the losing side would be summarily executed. That is, they would just be taken out and shot without a trial, or if there was a trial, it would be over with very quickly and just charges leveled, verdict rendered, and then the execution. So the question is there a legitimate reason to have trials for these defendants, these Nazis? The question is, did they commit a crime? How could you have a trial if there was no crime? In order for there to be a crime, there has to be a law against it. That's a basic principle of the rule of law. These concerns take us to this question. Did the Nuremberg trials violate the rule of law? If they did, then the trials would have been illegitimate. So here are objections that are raised to the Nuremberg trials that question whether they were consistent with the rule of law. First, there were no laws in place. There was nothing that made what the Nazis did illegal that they would have been under. There were no laws that governed all countries. Second, it's claimed that the laws used were retroactive, in that the things that the Nazis did were made illegal. The laws were passed after they had already done them, and then they were prosecuted under those laws. this does not give them fair warning, according to this objection. Next, since all the judges came from the winning side, it's thought that they could not be impartial. They were part of this group of people who had lost so much because of the Nazis, so how could they possibly render an impartial verdict? And finally, the Nazis would claim, well, we were following the law. We were following German law. That's the only law that we are subject to. The laws must come from a sovereign state, or they are not legitimate laws. We don't follow United States law or Russian law. We follow German law, and the laws came from Adolf Hitler, and he was the one we were required to follow under law. This leads to the famous Nuremberg defense, which is to say I was only following orders, which many of the Nazi defendants claimed in their defense. They were only following the orders of their commanding officer or the sovereign of their country. So, with those objections, there are some replies that people have made who want to claim that the Nuremberg trials were consistent with rule of law. They would claim that, well, there were laws in place, and these were international laws that were derived from treaties. Now, some people might think this is a stretch. These treaties countries enter into, there's a question about who enforces this treaty if someone breaks it. There is no higher law above the laws of these nations. So it's a question of whether these are actually the right kind of laws to be prosecuted under. Well, the next reply is that, well, in all cases, whether it's the Nuremberg trials or any kind of trial, judges try to be impartial. And this is an ideal that a judge or a jury would try to reach, although it may not be 100% that we could be impartial. And some people say, well, at least the defendants did receive due process, so that is in keeping with at least one principle of rule of law, that evidence was presented, that they had defense counsel to plead their case, and that a verdict was rendered. And there were actually 3 defendants who were acquitted. Now, several of them were found guilty and executed, and some of them were found guilty and sentenced to prison. But not all of them were found guilty, and they weren't all taken out and shot. So that's our major question for this lesson, but it also takes us over into discussion of morality and law, because some people might claim, well, even if the Nuremberg trials did violate rule of law, what the Nazis did was still immoral, and they still should be punished for what they did. And the trials did bring to light all the horrors that the Nazi regime had perpetrated on humanity. Okay, so of course we have assignments due this week. Discussion 12. The question is that some critics allege that the Nuremberg trials egregiously violated the rule of law, that they were just way beyond rule of law. So the trials were illegitimate. Now, if the trials did violate rule of law, could we still hold Nazi leaders and high-ranking officers guilty of crimes? Right? Is it possible that there are things that are crimes even though there's no law against them? Explain and justify your answers. And the talking points this week. First, explain in your own words how the Nuremberg trials could be seen as violating the rule of law. Refer to specific rule of law principles in your answers. It's important here that you use your own words so I can see that you are thinking through these questions. And second, explain in your own words how the Nuremberg trials could be seen as consistent with the rule of law. You should refer to specific rule of law principles in your answers. So you're taking either side here and just putting it into your own words why you think that the Nuremberg trials violated the rule of law, or why you might think that they did not violate the rule of law, or at least consistent with some of the principles. All right, so that does it for this week's video lecture.